I think we just need to renovate our education system totally, because I think trying to implement AI in a damaged education system, it wouldn't work.
It seems that the government alone, just by themselves, are unfit to do anything with AI and implementing it into schools. I think that needs to be done by people who really understand it.
I get frustrated when I see comments like the mutant algorithm. It's like, no, the algorithm wasn't mutant. The algorithm did what the algorithm was meant to do.
I don't think that you could ever really get a truly level playing field in terms of the education system.
Hello and welcome to the TeensInAI Podcast. Today we will be exploring the role of AI in education and what went wrong with the A-level algorithm. I am joined by Professor Rose Luckin, Director of Educate and Professor of Learner-Centered Design at UCL, and Carly Kind, Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute.
I don't think the government even thought about the young people that come from disadvantaged areas, because GCSE and A-level results open doors. They transform the lives of young people who are impoverished and come from those deprived areas.
The A-level algorithm sort of highlighted the educational inequalities in the UK, because many of my friends who come from poorer backgrounds received markedly lower grades than what they were predicted.
It is no secret that the A-level algorithm and the government's handling of the entire situation received an incredibly negative response from students, AI ethicists, and the public in general. To give a bit of background, the government used an algorithm to moderate teacher-assessed grades. The algorithm took into account the track record of schools, resulting in 40% of grades being downgraded. Majority of the downgraded grades were those of state school students. Why was bias allowed to remain so inherent in the design of the A-level algorithm, despite so much discussion around the negative impacts of such biases? This is a question I asked first Carly and then Professor Luckin.
So, as you know, it's a really complicated case of using an algorithmic system to make decisions. It's not necessarily the fact that there's a clear-cut problem with the algorithm and that problem was exposed in the use of it to decide A-level results, but rather there was a kind of complex series of policy decisions that were made that ended up in a result that was clearly felt to be unfair by students. And I think the easiest way to summarize that is that the people who worked in designing the system that came up with the results, they were optimizing for one version of what fairness looked like to them. And so they had this idea that a fair system would be a system in which teens and students would get marks that were consistent with marks that had been gotten in the previous year and the marks that would be gotten in the future, and so that there would be standardization across the past and the future as well. Equal distribution of marks across the whole system. And that's how that was the principle for which they were optimizing when they designed that system. But by optimizing for that one idea of fairness, they ignored, of course, other ideas of fairness, and in particular, they ignored the impact on the individuals who constituted that system. So even though maybe the majority were treated fairly, there were very, very negative impacts for a particular minority. And some people got particularly unfair results. And that is really what became the tipping point that led to public opinion turning against the algorithm. And I think that we can probably draw some conclusions about algorithmic systems more broadly, which is they tend to optimize for the majority and not for the minority.
If one of your kind of top success criteria for your algorithm is no grade inflation, then you're immediately putting in place a constraint that is highly likely to lead to a very skewed result, because you've made that a priority. Whereas perhaps, and particularly in this situation, with huge amounts of disruption and uncertainty, because we've never done this before, that may not have been the best thing to have as a priority. Maybe fairness would have been a better priority, which might have made you look more carefully at things like class size and look at the existing bias in the education system to try and make sure that you took that into account. And, you know, in all honesty, it's not unreasonable to ask how many of the people who were involved in the decision making around the algorithm actually really understood all of that. You know, and that's not meant in any way to insult anybody's intelligence, but some of the people involved in that won't have really known anything about algorithms or AI because they don't need to normally. And therefore, I think it's very hard for people to understand enough not to fall into traps where bias can go wrong. Now, obviously, there were lots of people who do understand AI and algorithms involved, but you can see how multiple decision makers, multiple opportunities for things to go wrong, and you end up with a situation where it goes wrong.
So how do we move forward? What have we, the general public and the government, learnt from this experience, and what happens if we're in the same situation next year?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I get frustrated when I see comments like the mutant algorithm. It's like, no, the algorithm wasn't mutant. The algorithm did what the algorithm was meant to do. It was actually that it was doing the wrong thing, if you see what I mean. It was the people who got it wrong. Let's be frank about that. I think transparency. I think in any situation where you have lost trust, the only way forward is to increase transparency, engage with people, talk to people about it. You know, think now about what we're going to do next year. We have no idea. Look at, I mean, as we speak, the number of cases are rising in the UK. I understand, you know, more announcements are being made about restrictions. How do we know we're not going to be in the same situation next year? Right, let's start now. Let's start now discussing this so that everybody can be part of the conversation on how it's going to be done. There seems to be a real fear about that transparency and dialogue. And yet I think in a situation where trust has been lost, that has to be the way forward.
It falls into at least 3 different buckets. The first set of answers is around process. So how do we improve the process by which algorithms are deployed in public sector bodies, in decision making that affects the public? So what does risk assessment look like, and how do we do it properly? How do we involve affected communities in risk assessment? How do we assess the impact of algorithmic systems? How do we consult? You know, were students consulted on the A-level algorithm? Did students get a chance to feed into how they want their futures to be decided? And how can we improve that from a process perspective? I think that's the first set of challenges. The second is around accountability and transparency. So how do we improve the accountability of these systems? How do we involve, for example, more external oversight? How could we potentially think about audit? So in the case of the A-levels algorithm, the Royal Statistical Society offered their support as an external set of experts, and that wasn't able to come to fruition because of a requirement around a non-disclosure agreement. But I think moving towards bringing in external experts in, because there's always a blind spot for all of us. It always helps to bring another set of eyes in. So how can we do that better? And how can we have independent controls over these types of systems? And how do we make sure that the redress mechanisms are really very strong? And then I think finally is around framing and messaging and communicating. So how do we change language which both idealizes technology and algorithms? So the whole idea of techno-solutionism, where we set technology up to be the solution to all of our problems. How do we move away from that? But also, how do we move away from treating algorithmic systems like they're an artifact that is outside of our control? So this, you heard Boris Johnson use the phrase mutant algorithm as if it's the kind of gremlin that's running around doing its own thing and is independently evil, and we can't change that. We need to change our language about how technology and data and AI are, how they come to be, how they can be influenced, how they can be tweaked and changed, and how they're integrated into decision making.
When I asked young people the same question, a clear distrust in the government and their ability to regulate and monitor AI seemed to be a common theme.
I think what's really sad about this is actually government failures like the A-level algorithm, they will always be remembered. It will just go down in history. You messed about with our lives, and you did something wrong. So it will undoubtedly affect the drive to deploy algorithms into public sectors, including education especially. You can't just play around with young people on something that will significantly impact their lives forever. So yeah, I don't think I even have much trust in the government. But the government must take steps to gain back the trust of young people, and that is by explaining to us the lessons they have learned from this A-level algorithm fiasco and what they would do next time if they potentially deal with the same or even a similar situation again in the future, I guess with other public sector algorithms that they're planning to make.
Just from the example of the A-level algorithm, it seems that the government alone, just by themselves, are unfit to do anything with AI and implementing it into schools. I think that needs to be done by people who really understand it and are involved in it all the time, every single day themselves.
Having heard this strong distrust from young people in the government's ability to regulate AI in education, I asked Carly and Professor Luckin how they thought AI should be regulated in the future of AI in education.
I've been working in this area for several decades now, and I am utterly convinced that the best way to achieve the potential of AI, there are huge potential benefits for AI in education, but I think the best way to achieve it is through bringing together the people who build the AI with the people who understand teaching and learning and who will be using that AI. And it has multiple benefits because, being frank, most of the people developing AI don't know anything about teaching and learning. Why would they? And most of the people who are experts in teaching and learning, the teachers out there in schools, colleges, universities, don't know anything about AI. Why would they? They might know a little bit, but not much. Now, but you need both of those expertise to really think about how AI can benefit education. You need to bring together those expertise. And one thing that's often forgotten when we talk about the huge advances that have been made with artificial intelligence technologies over the last couple of decades, and they've been huge. I mean, that moment in 2016 when AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol at Go is a game-changing moment. We've done some amazing stuff in AI, but we've also done some amazing stuff in understanding human learning in that time as well. We know way more about how humans learn than we did even 10 years ago. And that's that expertise that you need to bring in. So you need to really combine those. So I believe that we should be having, multi-stakeholder co-design activities. And then that way I think you end up with much better AI for education, much better designed and potentially much better applied. But also you end up with a population of designers who understand much more about teaching and learning, and you end up with a population of educators who understand much more about AI. And that's really important because that helps with the enterprise of educating about AI, which you also mentioned and which is, fundamentally important.
I think that from a practice point of view, the first principle should be involving students and parents in a conversation with teachers about how AI and algorithmic decision making can be used, whether that's from the perspective of class allocations to exams to, in some places we're starting to see AI tools being used to monitor grades and suggest where students need to brush up in certain areas and things like that. And I think there's a big debate to be had there. But I think the first principle should be that students, children, teenagers, and their parents should be really at the forefront of that discussion. I think personally it does need to happen at a national level, not on a school by school basis. And I think that for a few reasons. One is it's not fair for students to be subject to a postcode lottery where they either benefit or are disadvantaged by AI or technology based on where they live. And at the Ada Lovelace Institute, we've done quite a lot of public deliberation work where we work with members of the public to understand what they want and need out of new technologies. And one thing we hear often is that there should be a fair system throughout the country. I also think that the schools themselves are not equipped to really understand the benefits, disadvantages, the trade-offs of using new technologies. and they're not in a strong position to bargain and negotiate with the private sector when it comes to technology contracts. So it's really important that they have the support and expertise that is better, I think, developed at the national level, which is not to say that local authorities, for example, don't have a real role to play. But I do think that the support needs to come from the centre, and that's in terms of guidance, in terms of funding, in terms of strategy and approaches. I think that there should be a national approach to that.
In this podcast, we're only exploring a small selection of the many potential ways in which we could regulate AI in the future. But one thing that is clear is that transparency and dialogue and work between both the government and the industry experts is essential. Throughout this episode, we've heard the clear frustration of young adults towards the A-level algorithm and the government's handling of the situation, as well as a clear distrust in the government's ability to regulate AI into schools. But if we had to take a step back and look at the school system in general, what the A-level algorithm really highlighted was the inherent socio-economic discrimination in the UK school system. To finish the episode, I asked young adults one of the most pressing questions in AI in education today. How can we begin to implement AI into our education system when it is already so fundamentally flawed?
I feel like first things first, we need to I think we just need to renovate our education system totally, because I think trying to implement AI in a damaged education system, it wouldn't work. I think what it would do is just, exacerbate those inequalities already present, because I think, in the last few months, we've already seen just how damaging it is to have a classless education system. And I think it's something that everyone really learned. You know what? We have a classless education system, and all that did was just help to visually see clearly, I guess, in the whole panel, the whole world really, how bad our education system is. But this is something, this is a topic that's been speaked about for years, really. We don't have a good education system. We have instead an education system where state schools get cut funding all the time, and state schools are usually having to make, they're usually having to even, increase class sizes or do less teaching time with certain things.
Whilst many young adults had a similar opinion, others were more sceptical as to whether the A-level and education system could ever truly be fixed of its flaws.
I think that genuinely, I don't think that you could ever really get a truly level playing field in terms of the education system, because as you see, those who go to, say, the more selective schools or the private schools or whatnot, they tend to come from wealthier backgrounds, and so that sort of drives the inequality in education. So I think what the government should do there is just ensure that high quality resources are available to all, sort of like what edX or Khan Academy or what those online education providers are doing.
Hearing this divide in opinion, I posed the same question to Carly and Professor Luckin. How can we begin to implement AI into our education system when it is already so clearly fundamentally flawed?
I think it's a really, really big challenge. I suspect that if we try to tackle it just through the lens of AI, actually we end up needing to fix all of the other many problems with the school system as well. Perhaps there's a stronger argument that it shouldn't be just like the distribution of books or school or sporting facilities, but the distribution of technology and the in introduction of AI into schooling is going to change so fundamentally how children learn and how they prepare for later life, that there really does need to be some kind of standardization across schools. So there, I think you're really talking about government intervention, so restricting schools from adopting new AI tools unless and until a particular moment is reached, so that we could ensure a kind of level rollout. Unfortunately, the way that technology rollout generally works is not through a kind of national strategy. It is through this kind of piecemeal approach, and some people, some entities moving forward and faster, and then one step forward, two steps back as they realize the problems with that and need to adjust. And I suspect that's what we're going to see with schools. And I think that makes it very, very difficult actually for students and for parents who feel already at an information disadvantage in the kind of new era that they're raising their children in around data and privacy and social media and all of these things. And now to think that AI might be introduced into schools and that parents need to make choices about schools on that basis, I think it's an incredibly big challenge, really. And, you know, in an ideal world, I think we would see some kind of national strategy around that. And perhaps students could be part of agitating for that approach.
I've always felt that if we get it right, AI in education should be a wonderful democratizing force. Because I think for a lot of learners, we lose them very early. And it's often just because they're struggling with a difficult situation in their home lives. They don't understand something, they get behind, and it's really hard for them to catch up. And I think being able to provide, you know, individualized tutoring to complement the human teaching could be very powerful in helping students get back on top and not losing them.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Look out for our bonus episode this time next week, where I talk to Carly Kind, Professor Luckin, and Elena Snell, TeensInAI CEO and co-founder, about their careers, their advice for young people interested in tech and AI, further engagement opportunities, and their fears and thoughts on the future of AI. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I highly recommend checking out the blog posts that accompanied the release of this episode. They're written by interested young adults and cover topics such as can teachers and will teachers be replaced by AI? 7 lessons that we've learned from the A-level algorithm, amongst many other topics. They can be found on the TeensInAI website or on the TeensInAI medium. Thank you and goodbye.